Okay, folks, good morning. This is our last class. So it's the one where probably Hannah Arendt's most famous work, which is Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I'm just going to take you through it today. Last week, we talked about the controversy over Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I'll just make a reference to today, but I'm not going to focus on that today. Just want to take you through what she wrote so we can hear her in her own words and hear what she's trying to say. If you are interested in, more either about Eichmann or the trial, so there's just two books. I mentioned these at the very beginning of the class, but I'll mention them again that I would recommend. One is a book they're both relatively new. This is from 2014. It's a book by a German historian, Bettina Stagnet, called Eichmann Before Jerusalem, The Unexamined Life of a Mass Murderer. So this is, again, only from less than 10 years ago, is basically a study of Eichmann, what we know, what we've known since the trial, and in the subtitle you can get her take. He's a mass murderer. And then if you're interested in more on the trial, this was a book that was just published in 2021. I think it's papers from a conference on the Eichmann trial. It's called The Eichmann Trial Reconsidered, edited by Rebecca Whitman. So there's a bunch of different articles and takes on the trial, on aspects of the trial. So if you're interested in the trial, or you're interested in Eichmann, these are two books that'll cover that. What I'm talking about today is really what Hannah Arendt said about it, what she reported, how she understood it. A lot of the book is printed in the one volume Hannah Arendt, but not all of it. So I'm basically made a few selections that I will share with you, and I'll tell you where they are, if they're in the abridgment or not. But the whole book is worth reading, and as I said, despite the gruesome subject matter, it does read pretty well, and it was written for the New Yorker, so it's not dense academic writing. So I did read a bit last week from the first chapter, so I'm not going to redo that. And I'll just give you the pages from the original Eichmann Jerusalem, and I'll tell you whether it's in the first one is actually in the abridgment. It's from the chapter called An Expert on the Jewish Question, which is chapter 3 of Eichmann and Jerusalem. I just want to read from the very, very end of the chapter there where she sums up, and then she's talking about who Eichmann was, what his background was, how he became an SS officer. He rose to the ranks to be the SS equivalent of a lieutenant colonel, was never promoted above that, was basically mid-level management, and that he wasn't on the top level making the decisions of policy, but his job was carrying that out. It's the same thing in the Wannsee conference. He was at the Wannsee conference, but he was the staff person. He was the one who was staffing the conference. He wasn't one of the main, one who was figuring out the logistics of the final solution, discussing it at the conference. But then he was the executor who then carried it all out and worked for the people that made the policy. So that's his position. That's complicated about Eichmann. And she says at the end of that chapter, despite all the efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster. Right. That's what's controversial about her take on Eichmann, that she sees him as a human, and people thought, I think mistakenly, that she's trying to defend him or humanize him. And I'll read you what she writes. I'm going to read you the rest of this passage. But it was difficult indeed. So everybody could see this was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown. So I said last week, there are parts of the book that are funny, and a lot of people were offended by that. What did she see that was clownish in him? And since the suspicion would have been fatal to the whole enterprise, it was also rather hard to sustain in view of the sufferings he and his like had caused to millions of people. So she acknowledges the discrepancy there between his clownishness and his monstrous deeds. His worst clowneries were hardly noticed and almost never reported, except, of course, by Hannah Arendt. What could you do with a man who first declared with great emphasis that the one thing he had learned in an ill-spent life was that one should never take an oath, quote, today, and she quotes him, today no man, no judge could ever persuade me to make a sworn statement, to declare something under oath as a witness. I refuse it for moral reasons. Since my experience tells me that if one is loyal to his oath, one day he has to take the consequences. I have made up my mind once and for all that no judge in the world or any other authority will ever be capable of making me swear an oath to give sworn testimony. I won't do it voluntarily, and no one will be able to force me, end quote. So she's quoting him as saying that. And then after being told explicitly that if he wished to testify in his own defense, he might do so under oath or without an oath, the judge gave him the choice, he declared without further ado that he would prefer to testify under oath. Or, who repeatedly, with a great show of feeling, assured the court, as he had assured the police examiner, that the worst thing he could do would be to try to escape his true responsibilities, to fight for his neck, to plead for mercy, and then upon instruction of his counsel, submitted a handwritten document containing his plea for mercy. As far as Eichmann was concerned, these were questions of changing moods, and as long as he was capable of finding either in his memory or on the spur of the moment an elating stock phrase to go with them, he was quite content, without ever becoming aware of anything like inconsistencies. As we shall see, this horrible gift for consoling himself with cliches did not leave him in the hour of his death. And she'll come back to that when she talks about the moment of his death, his execution. So she continues to return to this idea that he's always spewing out cliches, and that it's just that his dealing with what he did is very unsophisticated. He grasped at cliches, and he's a very unsophisticated in that sense. So that was my what I wanted to share you from there. Then I'm going to move forward a bit in the book. That was on page 54, 55 I'm quoting from the unabridged, to page 114. And this is in the chapter called, and you do have this in the abridgment also, it's called The Wannsee Conference or Pontius Pilate. Now that's a very evocative title for the chapter on the Wannsee Conference. Actually, that's not in the abridgment there. And the reason why she calls it or Pontius Pilate is because she's citing his description of his role in the Wannsee Conference and of all of the functionaries who are surrounded around the table. Any of you on the trip that I brought to Germany? Well, yes, when we went, two of you were there, when we went to the Wannsee Conference House. It's extremely striking. So there's a beautiful mansion right on the lake, and in a sort of outside of Berlin, but not far, like a half an hour away. And you see this striking contrast between this beautiful locale where they had an executive retreat and they're sitting around the table in this dining room with views of this beautiful lake. And that was and then on the table, they preserve under the glass the minutes of the meeting of how many Jews could fit on how many trains, how many a day to be shipped here and there. And then it shows on the wall, remember, all the participants in the conference and what they did and then what happened to them afterwards. So Eichmann is talking about the conference. Again, he was staffing the conference, and he says, although he had doing his best right along to help with the final solution, he still had harbored some doubts about such a bloody solution through violence, and these doubts had now been dispelled. Because here now, during this conference, he says, the most prominent people had spoken, the popes of the Third Reich. That's how he described them. So that got rid of his doubts, because originally, and this is what she describes through the book, that at first his job was to get the Jews to leave Nazi Germany. The first focus was on expulsion, and then after that, the second phase was the concentration of Jews in the ghettos when they couldn't be expelled, and then in concentration camps, and then only the third phase was what's called the final solution. So she actually says the first solution, the second solution, and then the final solution, which is the killing, right, the mass execution of Jews. So he says, at that moment, I sensed a kind of Pontius Pilate feeling, for I felt free of all guilt. Right? And that's a quotation from Eichmann, that when he sees all of the leaders, he calls them the popes, the Third Reich, saying, this is what we're going to do, then he let go of his moral qualms. And she writes, who was he to judge? Who was he to have his own thoughts in this matter? Well, he was neither the first nor the last to be ruined by modesty. So again, it's a biting comment, but so she's saying a Pontius Pilate because he takes on the role as if he's Pontius Pilate. He didn't have a choice. He's just carrying out what was already determined, right? When Pontius Pilate says, it's not, I'm just the apologia carrying out the execution of Jesus, but it wasn't my idea and it would have happened without me. So that's why it's a very evocative title for the chapter there. Then moving along a few pages to 117. And this is where, let's point out before, one of the things that remember the two things that make the book so controversial, what we talked about last week. One is the humanizing portrait of Eichmann, which appears as if she's offending him. And the second is here, her harsh treatment of the Jews as collaborating with the Nazis. And this is where she talks about that. She said, to a Jew, after she talks about some of the detail, this role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. And then after going through more and more detail about it, this is after, she then sums up, and it's the end of that chapter. This is now on page 125. And this is the key passage that's always generally quoted as her most heartless, cruel passage in the book. She writes, wherever Jews lived, there were recognized Jewish leaders, and this leadership, almost without exception, cooperated in one way or another, for one reason or another, with the Nazis. The whole truth was that if the Jewish people had really been unorganized and leaderless, there would have been chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people. So that's considered her harshest, and why she's accused of being a self-hating Jew, of blaming the victims in that passage. And many of the scholars on Hannah Arendt, even those who defend her, say she probably should have phrased that a little differently there. But I believe that it is, when it's just quoted like that, is quoted out of context, because she goes on, she says elsewhere that this was true in every group of victims, that everyone collaborated, because you always feel like if you cooperate with your jailer or your prosecutor, that things will go easier than if you don't cooperate. And then she writes, that was that difficult passage. So just the very beginning of the next paragraph, she says, I have dwelt on this chapter of the story, which the Jerusalem trial failed to put before the eyes of the world in its true dimensions, because it offers the most striking insight into the totality of the moral collapse of the Nazis caused in respectable European society, not only in Germany, but in almost all countries, not only among the persecutors, but also among the victims. That is the key sentence of understanding the context, right? She's saying the reason why it's important is because of the totality of the moral collapse, which connects to her whole origins of totalitarianism, right? That's her whole analysis of totalitarianism, that it's a moral collapse of society where where truth disappears and you just follow what the leader says to do, and the individual is gone and the individual becomes superfluous. It's why we spent those 3 sessions going through each of the 3 parts of origins of totalitarianism. So that's why her analysis is consistent. And she's looking at it not to criticize the Jews. She's trying to look at it from a universal human perspective, not specifically from a Jewish perspective. Says this is the saddest part of the story for the Jews, but everyone reacted this way because it exemplifies the totality of the destruction of European civilization that was committed by the Nazis, where it got to this point that everyone just became cogs in the wheel, even the victims as well. And then towards the end of that very, very important chapter, she then has a whole long discussion about the exceptional Jews. She says that there was, people that were spared for different reasons, that weren't sent for execution, and among the Nazis. And she even has this in this quote elsewhere. She says, Hitler himself is said to have known 340 first-rate Jews. 340 first-rate Jews, So there are always exceptions, right? And she, and it's talked about how because Eichmann made a point of that in the defense and trial of, oh, he mitigated things, and especially for different groups and stuff. And she takes that to task, and she completely tears apart. And she says, in Germany today, this notion of prominent Jews has not yet been forgotten. While the veterans and other privileged groups are no longer mentioned, the fate of famous Jews is still deplored at the expense of all others. There are more than a few people, especially among the cultural elite, who still publicly regret the fact that Germany sent Einstein packing without realizing that it was a much greater crime to kill little Hans Kohn from around the corner, even though he was no genius. That's one of the most extraordinary passages in the book. It tears me up just every time I read that. I've read it so many times already. Little Hans Kohn, just some guy down the block, right? The little kid. That's a bigger crime than sending Einstein packing, because it's the total disappearance of any sense of morality, of ethics, the ethical fiber of society that was lost. And then going back to Dara Horn's critique of Hannah Arendt, right, when she says that Hannah Arendt did not appreciate Varian Fry and for rescuing her, and Dara Horn's her elegy to Varian Fry was that this was the type of person, a type of prophet who needs to be remembered, acknowledged, because this was a righteous person, and would that we have more people like that. I don't know that Dara Horn is aware of this passage, right? Because Hannah Arendt certainly did understand that, right? Because here she's not talking about Varian Fry and the Americans rescuing prominent Jews. She's talking about the Germans sparing prominent Jews, and she questions that. She's saying, stop folks talking about prominent people. It's the murder of little Hans Kohn down the end. There are more than a few people, especially among the cultural elite, who still publicly regret the fact that Germany sent Einstein packing without realizing that it was a much greater crime to kill little Hans Kohn from around the corner, even though he was no genius. She's also critiquing Germany then. Again, this is written in the early 60s, and there's other passages where she finds the expressions of guilt from the Adenauer Germany of early 60s as being insincere and inadequate to the guilt that should be expressed. I believe that she would assess Germany differently today. It's a different generation now. She's talking about people that are in the second generation. Today it's the third generation, so it's a bit different. Okay, then the next chapter of the book, chapter 8, is called Duties of a Law-Abiding Citizen. And it's in this chapter where she talks about, basically analyzes Eichmann's defense that he was just following orders. And there's an extraordinary passage, I don't have time to go into it in detail here, where Eichmann actually claims that he feels that he's following the Kantian approach and defends himself through Kant's philosophy, who's the great German philosopher of ethics. And she notes that when that was done, actually the presiding judge, remember we talked about the judges were all German Jews, so the presiding judge then starts interrogating Eichmann directly in German, because he finds it fascinating that Eichmann actually thinks he can defend himself through Kantian ethics. So, and it showed that he actually had read part of Kant, and he was defending himself. And then Arendt says it's misunderstanding Kant, because Eichmann is just taking it on a very, very basic level, that society comes up with its laws, and the laws are what you follow, which she says is really not what Kant is saying. But the fact that he offered a sort of a philosophical, he tried to present himself as an educated person, which she said he wasn't. But it's at the end of that chapter where she talks about what she analyzes. Does he have a conscience? Right? Or are those just platitudes that he could have gotten from somewhere else, just trying to defend the defense that in society, you do when you're down the chain, you do follow your orders. This is the question that's always come up. Like, at what point do you not follow an order if you understand that it is criminal? There was a point where he did, which proves his guilt. So at the very end of the war, Himmler, when saw that the war was lost, started to give orders behind Hitler's back to roll back the final solution, to stop the the gassing of the Jews and to do everything possible to make things better for the Jews still in custody of the Germans, hoping that then that would work out. Then he could negotiate with the Allies, and they would not be seen as criminals. And Eichmann thought that those orders were criminal, because those were illegal orders behind Hitler's back, and the structure was Hitler defined what the law was. So then she writes this: the case of the conscience of Adolf Eichmann, which is admittedly complicated, but is by no means unique, is scarcely comparable to the case of the German generals, one of whom, and she has a long analysis of the Count Stauffenberg attempt to assassinate Hitler and how that was understood down the line. So she says, it's scarcely comparable to the case of the German generals. That's the ones who tried to assassinate Hitler. One of whom, when asked at Nuremberg, how was it possible that all of you honorable generals could continue to serve a murderer with such unquestioning loyalty? Sorry, these are not the real, this is the other general, the ones who just did their job. They replied that it was not the task of a soldier to act as judge over his supreme commander. Let history do that, or God in heaven. That was Jodl, who was hanged at Nuremberg, was one of the chief generals of the army. Eichmann, she writes, much less intelligent and without any education to speak of, at least dimly realized that it was not an order but a law which had turned them all into criminals. The distinction between an order and the Führer's word was that the latter's validity was not limited in time and space, which is the outstanding characteristic of the former. This is also the true reason why the Führer's order for the final solution was followed by a huge shower of regulations and directives, all drafted by expert lawyers and legal advisors, not by mere administrators. This order, in contrast to ordinary orders, was treated as a law. You know, that was the structure of how the Third Reich worked, that when Hitler expressed his view, everything else, the whole legal apparatus just rushed to adapt itself to the view that he expressed. And that's the totalitarian system. And that's, if you go back again, when we read those passages in Origins of Totalitarianism, she said that you couldn't figure out Soviet policy by reading Lenin or reading the protocols or the last time those last Soviet Congress met. The only way to determine Soviet policy was the mood of Stalin when Stalin woke up on any particular morning. You know, and then everyone would just adjust to that. And that's what, although Eichmann didn't have the education of the generals, he implicitly just was, you know, she argues a victim, basically. Doesn't mean he's innocent, but a victim of that system. And then I read the last paragraph in that chapter. And just as the law in civilized countries assumes that the voice of conscience tells everybody, thou shalt not kill, even though man's natural desires and inclinations may at times be murderous, so the law of Hitler's land demanded that the voice of conscience tell everyone, thou shalt kill, although the organizers of the massacres knew full well that murder is against the normal desires and inclinations of most people. Evil in the Third Reich had lost the quality by which most people recognize it, the quality of temptation. Many Germans and many Nazis, probably an overwhelming majority of them, must have been tempted not to murder, not to rob, not to let their neighbors go off to their doom. For that the Jews were transported to their doom they knew, of course, even though many of them may not have known the gruesome details. And not to become accomplices in all these crimes by benefiting from them. But God knows they had learned how to resist temptation. This is classic Hannah Arendt, right? She says that usually you're tempted to commit evil. In the Third Reich, the temptation would be to not commit the evil that Hitler wanted them to do, but they resisted that temptation, most of them, you know, and it was very few who resisted. And this goes into understanding the difference between, and the philosophical difference in her analysis between the radical evil and the banality of evil. Radical evil is that type of totalitarian society where evil and goodness are reversed. That's radical evil. The individual actor is the banality of evil, because Eichmann is not a monster. He's a perpetrator, but he's not a mastermind monster. And that distinction, which is a fine distinction, but you can get a sense of this here, and it's what she tries to trace historically in Origins of Totalitarianism. This was why she wanted to write this about the Eichmann trial, because that was the case study that demonstrated what she had already sought to analyze in detail in Origins of Totalitarianism. Which takes us to the next chapter, which is chapter 9. Then she goes through, she starts with the deportations, and basically the book goes through, she basically outlines the own story. What Hausner, the prosecutor in the Eichmann trial, did is he used the Eichmann trial as an opportunity to teach Israel, the Jewish people, the world, what happened in the Holocaust. She does the same thing, but she reorganizes the information and prosecutes it in her way rather than Hausner's way. And the order is, as I said, first she talks about the first solution, expulsion, the second solution, concentration, the final solution, killing, and then the Wannsee Conference, which focuses on the planning of the killing. And then this was the sense of conscience. And then she goes back in time and she goes through the deportations. And then there's the deportations from the Reich, which is Germany, Austria, and the protectorate of the Czech lands that they took over. And then chapter 10 is deportations from Western Europe, France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Italy. Chapter 11 is deportation from the Balkans, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Romania. Chapter 12 is deportations from Central Europe, Hungary, and Slovakia. And then she goes through each country, but in each region, it's handled differently. And then you get to chapter 13, which is the killing centers in the East. That's when she focuses on Auschwitz and the other death camps. And then the last two chapters are, then she goes back to the trial. And chapter 14 is called Evidence and Witnesses, where she then goes back and describes the structure of the trial, the issues of the trial. And then chapter 15 is judgment, appeal, and execution, which is what happened after the trial. So that's just the structure of her book. So in chapter 9, which is deportations from the Reich, Germany, Austria, and the protectorate, she goes right in to where she ended the last chapter, which is this issue of, did Eichmann have a conscience? Between the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, when Eichmann felt like Pontius Pilate and washed his hands in innocence, and Himmler's orders in the summer and fall of 1944, when behind Hitler's back, the final solution was abandoned as though the massacres had been nothing but a regrettable mistake, according to Himmler, Eichmann was troubled by no questions of conscience between this whole period. His thoughts were entirely taken up with the staggering job of organization and administration in the midst not only of a world war, but more important for him, of innumerable intrigues and fights over spheres of authority among the various state and party offices which were busy solving the Jewish question. So, again, I talked about this book earlier, Bettina Stagnant's book, Eichmann Before Jerusalem. She's going to take issue with that, and she's going to argue, no, Eichmann really was committed to the ideas. He really did want to, he thought that genocide was the answer, and she tries to mitigate her portrayal of Eichmann as a bureaucrat. Again, that's a different issue, right? I think it's important because her reading of Eichmann is important for her understanding overall of what it means when you have a civilization descends into totalitarianism. So Eichmann, she's writing about a person, but she's also writing about every German perpetrator, and any perpetrator in a totalitarian environment. So I want to say that it's important to understand her analysis, whether or not it's factually true or not. And again, her evidence is limited to what was available at the time. And that was when I had mentioned to you that I had spoken with a political philosophy professor who said, I don't teach Eichmann in Jerusalem because there's so evidence that shows that it was inaccurate. For me, it doesn't, the evidence is sort of irrelevant. What's more relevant for me is that she is one of the most brilliant political philosophers of the 20th century, and Jewish emigres coming out of Nazi Germany, how she understood what happened and how she was able to explain it is, for me, the more interesting questions. So a couple pages later in that chapter, this is page 153. What for Hitler, the sole lonely plotter of the final solution, right? Because Hitler is the one that's the mastermind. And then she writes, never had a conspiracy of such it was needed fewer conspirators and more executors, was among the war's main objectives, with the implementation given top priority, the final solution we're talking about, regardless of economic and military considerations. And what for Eichmann was a job, with its daily routine, its ups and downs, was for the Jews quite literally the end of the world. I want to keep reading in this passage because I think that when she's criticized for being a self-hating Jew, anti-Zionist. Here you'll hear her Jewish soul speaking. For Hitler, it was the main objective. For Eichmann, it was a job. For the Jews, it was the end of the world. For hundreds of years, they had been used to understanding their own history, rightly or wrongly, as a long story of suffering, much as the prosecutor described it in his opening speech at the trial. But behind this attitude, there had been for a long time the triumphant conviction of Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel shall live. Individual Jews, whole Jewish families might die in pogroms, whole communities might be wiped out, but the people would survive. They had never been confronted with genocide. Moreover, the old consolation no longer worked anyhow, at least not in Western Europe. Since Roman antiquity, that is, since the inception of European history, the Jews had belonged, for better or worse, in misery or in splendor, to the European comedy of nations. But during the past 150 years, it had been chiefly for better. And the occasions of splendor had become so numerous that in Central and Western Europe, they were felt to be the rule. Hence, the confidence that the people would eventually survive no longer held great significance for large sections of the Jewish communities. They could no more imagine Jewish life outside the framework of European civilization than they could have pictured to themselves a Europe that was Judenrein. So her point is that the Holocaust is different from everything else in the history of anti-Semitism before, because it's not just a passing pogrom. It's a universal attempt to completely wipe the Jewish people off the map. Even Haman in the book of Esther only wants to eliminate them from Persia, not from everywhere in the world. So it's a completely different phenomenon, and she's looking at it from the perspective of a crime of human history. And she's also looking at it from only 20 years after the war, not imagining a rebirth of Jewish life in Europe that we've sort of seen today. And she's also critiquing Hausner and the Israeli state's prosecution of the Eichmann trial as understanding the Holocaust as the culmination of anti-Semitism, which is what the state of Israel is the antidote to that. She criticizes that constant refrain of the history of anti-Semitism because she sees this as something different. And I'll get to a few more passages how that's carried through in her writing. So I'm going to jump now in the book all the way to page 230. So this is in the chapter called Evidence and Witnesses, which is chapter 14. And she talks about a moment, and this is in one, the different witnesses who are offering their testimony. It says that a slightly tense moment, this one witness happened to mention the name of Anton Schmidt, a Feldwebel, which is German for a sergeant, in the German army, a name that was not entirely unknown to this audience, for Yad Vashem had published Schmidt's story some years before in his Hebrew bulletin, and a number of Yiddish papers in America had picked it up. Anton Schmidt was in charge of a patrol in Poland that collected stray German soldiers who were cut off from their units. In the course of doing this, he had run into members of the Jewish underground, including Abba Kovner, who's the person who's giving this testimony at the trial, who's a prominent member of the partisans of Jewish underground. And he had helped, and this German sergeant, Anton Schmidt, had helped the Jewish partisans by supplying them with forged papers and military trucks. Most important of all, he did not do it for money, which is Abba Kovner's testimony. Right? It wasn't being bribed. And this had gone on for months, from October 1941 to March 1942, when Anton Schmidt was caught, arrested, and executed. The prosecution had elicited the story because Kovner declared that he had first heard the name of Eichmann from Schmidt, who had told him about rumors in the army that it was Eichmann who arranges everything. This was by no means the first time that help from the outside non-Jewish world had been mentioned. He talks about, because, when they say this is just one story, but there were few and more have come up later of, this Rabbi Shem collects all and commemorates the righteous Gentiles. This was a brave German sergeant who did what he did to help the partisans because he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, and then as she wraps up this chapter, she says why did most people not do something, right? Not help. During the few moments it took Kovner to tell of the help that had come from a German sergeant, a hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out clearly, irrefutably, beyond question: how utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told. Now, there are, of course, explanations of this devastating shortage. And then she talks about another, refers to how there was the sense that many Germans had said, that she cites, that there was just nothing that they could do, right? That they were, and anyone who had seriously, we knew this, we did nothing. Anyone who had seriously protested or done anything against the killing unit would have been arrested within 24 hours, would have disappeared. And then, and that's how most people explain why they did not resist or oppose the state. It belongs among the refined, and here it goes back to her philosophy of totalitarianism. It belongs among the refinements of totalitarian governments in our century that they don't permit their opponents to die a great dramatic martyr's death for their convictions. There was a very powerful section in Origins that I had read where it talks about one of the crimes of when the Nazis put the Jews into the gas chambers, they denied them the opportunity of being martyrs. They made their deaths anonymous, and took away the identity of their victims. A totalitarian state lets, and this is what she says here, a totalitarian state lets its opponents disappear in silent anonymity. It is certain that anyone who had dared to suffer death rather than silently tolerate the crime would have sacrificed his life in vain. This is not to say that such a sacrifice would have been morally meaningless. It would only have been practically useless, right? If you let yourself be killed, it still has moral validity, but would it have made a difference? None of us had a conviction so deeply rooted that we could have taken upon ourselves a practically useless sacrifice for the sake of a higher moral meaning. Needless to add, the writer who she's quoting from there remains unaware of the emptiness of his emphasized decency in the absence of what he calls higher moral meaning. But, she says, the hollowness of respectability, for decency under such circumstances is no more than respectability, was not what became apparent in the example offered by Sergeant Anton Schmidt. Rather, it was the fatal flaw in the argument itself, which at first sounds so hopelessly plausible. She argues there against her whole description of totalitarianism, because she said that ultimately there are human beings who will do the right thing. And the totalitarian experiment will never be successful. She's an extraordinary statement of optimism here. As she's saying, her description of the descent into totalitarianism is what happens, but there will always be resistance to it. And that's why she writes in so much of her other writings that every time a new person is born, there's a new opportunity for the world to be made better. It is true that totalitarian domination tried to establish these holes of oblivion into which all deeds, good and evil, would disappear. But just as the Nazis' feverish attempts from June 1942 on to erase all traces of the massacres through cremation, through burning in open pits, through the use of explosives and flamethrowers and bone-crushing machinery, were doomed to failure. Right? This is why they burned, and even after they dug up the mass burials and burned, why they tried to commit so much cremation as possible, which is one of the reasons why it's not a halakhic reason. Generally, Judaism is against the cremation, but especially after the Holocaust, because cremation was the chosen avenue of the Nazis to destroy any evidence of their victims. Because if you cremated the body, there's nothing left, so there's no evidence of what they did. All of this was doomed to failure. So all efforts to let their opponents disappear in silent anonymity were in vain. The holes of oblivion do not exist. This tremendous passage of her optimism here. The holes of oblivion do not exist. Nothing human is that perfect, and there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. One man will always be left alive to tell the story. There will always be at least one person left. Hence, nothing can ever be practically useless, at least not in the long run. It would be of great practical usefulness for Germany today, not merely for her prestige abroad, but for her sadly confused inner condition, if there were more such stories to be told. For the lesson of such stories is simple and within everybody's grasp. Politically speaking, it is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. Humanly speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. Right? And she goes through and says, in some countries, they did save the Jews. In most, they didn't. Some people did the right thing. Most people didn't. But all you need is for some people to do the right thing is the most that we can reasonably ask for the planet to remain a place fit for human habitation, right? So that's going to come through whether it's fit for human habitation in her explanation of why it was correct for the court to execute Eichmann. So I'm going to get to that. So let me move along here. And now I'm in the chapter called Judgment, Appeal, and Execution. This is in the book about page 246. Eichmann, it will be remembered, had steadfastly insisted that he was guilty only of aiding and abetting in the commission of the crimes with which he was charged, and that he himself had never committed an overt act. Right? That was his main defense, that he never actually killed anybody himself. And she writes, the judgment, to one's great relief, in a way recognized that the prosecution had not succeeded in proving him wrong on this point. For it was an important point. It touched upon the very essence of this crime, which was no ordinary crime, and the very nature of this criminal, who was no common criminal by implication. It also took cognizance of the fact that in the death camps, it was usually the inmates and the victims who had actually wielded the fatal instrument with their own hands. Now, again, a lot of people got very angry when she wrote that, because it was usually the Jewish inmates who were the ones who actually had to close the doors and turn the gas oven and then take the bodies into all of the actual physical actions the Jewish inmates were forced to do. But the reason why she says that is the point that clearly they're the least guilty, even though they're the ones who did the most physical acts. What the judgment means the ruling of the court, had to say on this point was more than correct. It was the truth. And then she quotes from the judges, expressing his activities in terms of Section 23 of our Criminal Code Ordinance, that's the Israeli law that he was tried under. We should say that they were mainly those of a person soliciting by giving counsel or advice to others, and of one who enabled or aided others in the criminal act. But in such an enormous and complicated crime as the one we are now considering, wherein many people participated on various levels and in various modes of activity, the planners, the organizers, and those executing the deeds, according to their various ranks, there is not much point in using the ordinary concepts of counseling and soliciting to commit a crime. For these crimes were committed en masse, not only in regard to the number of victims, but also in regard to the number of those who perpetrated the crime. And the extent to which any one of the many criminals was close to or remote from the actual killer of the victim means nothing as far as the measure of his responsibility is concerned. On the contrary, and then she puts this in italics, she's still quoting from the court, but this is the key sentence. In general, the degree of responsibility increases as we draw further away from the man who uses the fatal instrument with his own hands, right? Because he said he didn't kill anyone himself, that's what makes him more guilty, right? The further that you are away from the actual flipping of the switch, the more responsible you are, because that was the structure. That was the totalitarian structure that was responsible for what was happening here. And then want to go back now. This is her description of his, what happens is that he is, so they pass the judgment for execution. Then he immediately appeals, and the appeal goes to the president of the state of Israel, who as the head of state has the right to grant clemency. And Yitzhak Ben Zvi, it only took a day and then denied all the claims to clemency. But there were a lot of people arguing for it. It's good for us to know that one, Martin Buber, was the front name of a petition of a lot of professors at the Hebrew University who were arguing against the death penalty. And she argues against Martin Buber, because Martin Buber is claiming that this is going to assuage the guilt of Germans. And to which she said the Germans don't even understand what it means to be guilty. She's writing about Germans then, but she has a great passage about it where she says, let me see if I can find that for you here. Hold on a second. The youth of Germany is surrounded on all sides, in all walks of life, by men in positions of authority in public office who are very guilty indeed, but feel nothing of the sort. But the normal reaction to this state of affairs should be indignation, but indignation will be quite risky, not a danger to life and limb, but definitely a handicap in a career. For those young German men and women who every once in a while, on the occasion of all the diary of Anne Frank hubbub and of the Eichmann trial, treat us to hysterical outbreaks of guilt feelings, are not staggering under the burden of the past, their father's guilt. Rather, they are trying to escape from the pressure of very present and actual problems in sheep sentimentality. So she's not forgiving the Germans. As I said, she might feel different about the current generation, which she's writing up the grandchildren of the perpetrators. And I think Germany has taken extraordinary steps this generation has taken, but not necessarily the first or second generation. She also, in addition to Martin Buber, there was a petition from the Central Conference of American Rabbis. The Reform Rabbinate appealed to the present state of Israel for clemency to not execute him for similar reasons. I was not aware of that. I was happy to hear that that was the Central Conference and not the Rabbinical Assembly. And finally, she says there were those who were just generally against the death penalty in general. And she writes, least of all was heard from those who were against the death penalty on principle, unconditionally. Their arguments would have remained valid since they would not have needed to specify them for this particular case. They seem to have felt, rightly, I think, that this was not a very promising case in which to fight. Right? If you're opposed to the death penalty, the Eichmann case is not a good case to make that argument for. But then she writes, he went to the gallows with great dignity. Right? He played the part. He asked for a bottle of red wine and had drunk half of it. He refused the help of the Protestant minister, the Reverend William Hull, who offered to read the Bible with him. He had only 2 hours to live and therefore no time to waste. He walked the 50 yards. So when she says great dignity, she's being facetious here. He walked the 50 yards from his cell to the execution chamber, calm and erect, with his hands bound behind him. When the guards tied his ankles and knees, he asked them to loosen the bonds so that he could stand straight. I don't need that, he said when the black hood was offered him. He was in complete command of himself. Nay, he was more. He was completely himself. Nothing could have demonstrated this more convincingly than the grotesque silliness of his last words. This is her understanding of him as a clown, comes forward. He began by stating emphatically that he was a Gottgläubiger, a God believer, to express in common Nazi fashion that he was no Christian and did not believe in life after death. He was just a general spiritual person, but didn't believe in the doctrines of life after death. He then proceeded, after a short while, gentlemen, we shall all meet again. Such is the fate of all men. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria. I shall not forget them. And then she writes, those were his last words. And then she writes, in the face of death, he had found the cliche used in funeral oratory. It's just the cliches, right? Under the gallows, his memory played him the last trick. He was elated, and he forgot that this was his own funeral. It was as though in those last minutes, he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us, the lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil. And that's where she gets her subtitle from. And that's the point, that this was the banality of evil. This was not a monster. He's guilty, but that's her take on it. So what did Israel do then? So then they cremated his body, and they scattered his ashes in the Mediterranean just outside of Israeli waters. The reason why they cremated the body was that there would be no grave, no place for neo-Nazis to go and, anything like that. Okay, then there's the epilogue, and I want to read you. And in the epilogue, she explains and she analyzes the judgments. I think we have just enough time to work through this. Okay. She talks a lot about the argument because she takes most seriously the argument that her teacher Karl Jaspers had made, which I quoted from their letters last week. He also presented this publicly in a radio interview at the time, that it should have been an international court and not a Israeli court. And she defends Israel's jurisdiction right? She says that he committed crimes, he murdered millions of Jews, and this is the country where most Jews were all Jews. So certainly Israel has any right to prosecute him as any other country. And at that time, there was no International Court of Justice. She says that but then she gets more specific on that the crime, what it means, a crime against humanity versus crimes against the Jewish people. And her critique of the prosecution is that they argued it as the culmination of anti-Semitism and the crimes against the Jewish people. And she's taking a more universalist philosophical perspective. This is not an ordinary crime against the Jewish people. This is a crime against humanity, which is why he doesn't deserve to live anymore as a human, right? That's her defense of the death penalty. So, and I'll just read you a few passages here. She says, it was the misunderstanding in the eyes of Jews, thinking exclusively in terms of their own history, the catastrophe that had befallen them under Hitler, in which a third of the people perished, appeared not as the most recent of crimes, the unprecedented crime of genocide, but on the contrary, as the oldest crime they knew and remembered. Right? That's her issue with the popular Jewish understanding, that this is the worst case of everything that's happened for 2,000 years. Everyone hates us. If you don't get it before, get it now. She has a very different take. She says this is entirely different than anything that has happened before. This misunderstanding, almost inevitable if we consider not only the facts of Jewish history, but also, and more important, the current Jewish historical self-understanding, is actually at the root of all the failures and shortcomings of the Jerusalem trial. None of the participants ever arrived at a clear understanding of the actual horror of Auschwitz, which is of a different nature from all the atrocities of the past, because it appeared to prosecution and judges alike not much more than the most horrible pogrom in Jewish history. And in her argument, this is much worse than the most horrible pogrom of Jewish history. Not that that's not a bad thing, right? They therefore believed that a direct line existed from the early anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party to the Nuremberg laws, and from there to the expulsion of Jews from the Reich, and finally to the gas chambers. Politically and legally, however, these were crimes, different not only in degree of seriousness, but in essence. And then she talks about the Nuremberg laws of 1935, when this was the beginning of the legal discrimination against Jews. Hitler came to power in January of 1933, but it's only in 1935 that that things start to go bad for the Jews. And she argues that those are not crimes against humanity, that it's discrimination, right? But it's discrimination that is still legal within a state, right? And she makes a distinction between discrimination, legal discrimination, and expulsion and genocide. Expulsion and genocide are crimes against humanity. Genocide is much worse. But why is expulsion a crime against humanity? And it's important because she lost her homeland. So for her, becoming homeless makes you a persona non grata in the world structured in nation states. And then you become a wandering person with no country to defend you. That was her argument in the Origins, right? That the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the values of the Enlightenment mean nothing if there's no state to defend it. And if the state wipes its hands of you, then those rights mean nothing, right? Because no one stands up for you. So she writes, expulsion. So expulsion is already an offense against humanity. If by humanity we understand no more than the comity of nations. Because then you're basically pushing these people on other nations, and it disturbs the comity of nations when you say, I don't want these people, I'm expelling them without anyone else taking them. And so legalized discrimination had been practiced by all Balkan countries. The expulsion in mass scale had occurred after many revolutions. It was when the Nazi regime declared the German people not only were unwilling to have any Jews in Germany, but wished to make the entire Jewish people disappear from the face of the earth, that the new crime, the crime against humanity in the sense of a crime against the human status or against the very nature of mankind appeared. And that's the connection between expulsion and genocide. Expulsion and genocide, though both are international offenses, must remain distinct. The former, expulsion, is an offense against fellow nations, whereas the latter, genocide, is an attack upon human diversity as such, that is upon a characteristic of the human status without which the very words mankind or humanity would be devoid of meaning. Had the court in Jerusalem understood that there were distinctions between discrimination, expulsion, and genocide, it would immediately have become clear that the supreme crime it was confronted with, the physical extermination of the Jewish people, was a crime against humanity, perpetrated upon the body of the Jewish people, and that only the choice of victims, not the nature of the crime, could be derived from the long history of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. Her point is, if it's a crime against humanity, then you have to talk about the other victims and the non-Jewish victims. She said, no. Even if only the victims were Jewish, the fact that you want to eliminate a people from the face of the earth makes it a crime against humanity, which is a higher crime than just than anything else in a philosophical sense, right? Okay. And then, having read that, I'm moving along to page 273. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because if you crime against the human people, then you have no place within humans. Yeah, whereas if you have a crime against people, and other people can take you in, give you clemency, then that's just a dispute between peoples. So she's writing about also the courts that this was sort of, you have the Nuremberg trials, you have other trials, you have this, and this is just the latest in the trials. And some people say that, what's the use of these trials? She argues that they are important because or not the rather uncomfortable but hardly deniable possibility that similar crimes may be committed in the future. What people have done in the past, they could do again. She argues elsewhere that once a crime is committed for the first time, it makes it more likely it'll be committed again. And that's why, many times when people say the Holocaust is like nothing that ever came before, sometimes universalists get upset by that, because they think that Jews are saying, oh, no one suffered the way we suffered. But she says the Holocaust is like nothing that happened ever before, but that means it can be committed on other people too, right? Because once it happens once, it could happen again. And that's her argument in Origins of Totalitarianism, that the same structure happened in communist Russia, Soviet Union, that happened in Nazi Germany, the same potential, right, of destruction of people. So she writes, the reasons for the sinister potentiality are general as well as particular. It's the key passage here. It is in the very nature of things human that every act that has once made its appearance and has been recorded in the history of mankind stays with mankind as a potentiality long after its actuality has become a thing of the past. Okay, so that's a point there. Now, I'm continuing on in the chapter. She talks about one of the issues, there was the problem of whether people criticized whether it was appropriate for the victors to be the judges. And she argues it is appropriate. There's the issue of the valid definition of a crime against humanity, and then the recognition the criminal commits the crime, whether he's guilty. So she argues that Israel had every right to try this trial. Then what is she talking about? What is the struggling over defining the term crime against humanity? And the first definition goes to the Nuremberg trials, and she says, I've mentioned the findings of the Jerusalem court were incomparably better than those at Nuremberg. So they've made some progress, and there's been a lot of progress since then, since the Eichmann trial, of course. And I mentioned before the Nuremberg Charter's definition of crimes against humanity, this is from the Nuremberg trial, as inhuman acts. That was the term they used. And the German translation of inhuman acts was Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit, which means Verbrechen, meaning breakages against Menschlichkeit. So then she writes, as though the Nazis had simply been lacking in human kindness. Because menschlich is not menschlich. Then she writes, certainly the understatement of the century. Right? Okay, so then on the next page, on 276, give me another 10 minutes just to wrap this up. So then she talks about Hausner and the inconsistency in the prosecution, in which Mr. Hausner, who was the state prosecutor, wanted to try the most abnormal monster the world had ever seen, and at the same time try in him many like him and even the whole Nazi movement and anti-Semitism at large. So that's the logical inconsistency. She's saying, this is a monster, but I'm also standing in for every anti-Semite and anyone who ever been or ever before. So she's saying you can't have it both ways. If he's doing what so many other people have done, then his evil is banal, right? And that's what she means, a banality of evil. They knew, of course, that it would have been very comforting indeed to believe that Eichmann was a monster And here she gets to the heart of the issue, right? It would be easy to believe that Eichmann was a monster, even though if he had been Israel's case against him would have collapsed, or at the very least lost all interest, because Israel's real interest was explaining to the world the problem of anti-Semitism and why it's important to have a state of Israel. Surely one could, right? Because if he was just one monster, you kill him and it's over, right? Then we don't have any problems anymore. Surely one can hardly call upon the whole world and gather correspondence from the four corners of the earth in order to display Bluebird in the dock. Here's the key point. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. Right? This is the key point. That's what's terrifying. What's terrifying is that he was not a monster. That's what makes it so scary. And this is something I've been talking about a lot, and I talk about this in introduction to my book on World War I, when the whole issue among historians was the Holocaust something that was peculiar, specific to Germans, or, I said no, that it could, things could have gone differently in Germany, and to argue that, in my sense, is a scarier but much more realistic argument to understand, and that's what she argues in Origins of Totalitarianism, right? That the elements to commit the worst, the radical evil, exist everywhere. And that's a much more scary and a much more difficult understanding than to say, oh, these were monsters that never were and never will be again. Because that gets everyone off the hook and is a bit blind to the real nature of evil in the world. So she says, because he had been implicated and had played a central role in an enterprise whose open purpose was to eliminate forever certain races from the surface of the earth, that's why he had to be eliminated. So this is her argument about why it was appropriate to execute him. And then she says, and if it is true that justice will not only be done, but must be seen to be done, then the justice of what was done in Jerusalem would have emerged to be seen by all if the judges had dared to address their defendant in something like the following terms. So, she quoted from the judgment, said it was legally correct, but this is what she would say if she were the presiding judge. And then she gives you what she would say to Eichmann. So what does Hannah Arendt say directly to Eichmann? I'll just read this, it's a page and a half, and then that's it. You admitted that the crime committed against the Jewish people during the war was the greatest crime in recorded history. And you admitted your role in it. But you said that you had never acted from base motives, that you had never had any inclination to kill anybody, that you never hated Jews, and still that you could have acted otherwise, and that you did not feel guilty. We find this difficult, though not altogether impossible, to believe. There is some, though not very much, evidence against you in this matter of motivation and conscience that could be proved beyond reasonable doubt. You also said that your role in the final solution was an accident and that almost anybody could have taken your place, so that potentially almost all Germans are equally guilty. What you meant to say was that where all or almost all are guilty, nobody is. This is an indeed quite common conclusion, but one we are not willing to grant you. And if you don't understand our objection, we would recommend to your attention the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, two neighboring cities in the Bible, which were destroyed by fire from heaven because all the people in them had become equally guilty. Meaning, just to say everyone's guilty doesn't mean no one's guilty. Right? This, incidentally, has nothing to do with the newfangled notion of collective guilt, according to which people supposedly are guilty of or feel guilty about things done in their name but not by them, things in which they did not participate and from which they did not profit. In other words, guilt and innocence before the law are of an objective nature, and even if 80 million Germans had done as you did, this would not have been an excuse for you. Luckily, we don't have to go that far. You yourself claimed not the actuality, but only the potentiality of equal guilt on the part of all who lived in a state whose main political purpose had become the commission of unheard of crimes. And no matter through what accidents of exterior or interior circumstances you were pushed onto the road of becoming a criminal, there is an abyss between the actuality of what you did and the potentiality of what others might have done. Right? That goes to the case of Anton Schmidt. There's an abyss between what you did and what a good person would have done. We are concerned here only with what you did. and not with the possible non-criminal nature of your inner life and of your motives, or with the criminal potentiality of those around you. You told your story in terms of a hard luck story, and knowing the circumstances, we are up to a point willing to grant you that under more favorable circumstances, it is highly unlikely that you would ever have come before us or before any other criminal court. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that it was nothing more than misfortune that made you a willing instrument in the organization of mass murder. There still remains the fact that you have carried out and therefore actively supported a policy of mass murder. For politics is not like the nursery. In politics, obedience and support are the same. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. That is the reason and the only reason you must hang. That's Hannah Arendt's words to Adolf Eichmann, the Jew who was expelled from Germany, to the most famous perpetrator who was tried for his crimes. So I think it was worth reading. I gave a lot of context on Hannah Arendt. Could do a whole nother year analyzing all of her other works. But I think it's a book like this. There's a reason why it's so famous. There's a reason why why it's controversial, but it's worth a careful read. Thank you. Happy Father's Day.